The people in this program and the two that follow are going to tell you that almost everything you know about AIDS is wrong. Here's an example. It's from Luc Montagnier, who discovered HIV, the virus that's associated with AIDS. Dr. Montagnier says, "It simply isn't true that HIV is 100% fatal, nor does AIDS itself inevitably lead to death, especially if you suppress the cofactors that support the disease." Dr. Montagnier was one of the people at a symposium in May sponsored by the Foundation for Alternative AIDS Research and underwritten by the Dutch government. This program is about what went on at the conference in Amsterdam. It's not a program about pathetic victims or worldwide panic. It won't break your heart or terrorize you. Instead, this program from the Amsterdam Symposium is about scientific guesswork and determination. It's not a moral crusade against sex disguised as a medical lecture. In other words, it's not like anything you've ever seen about AIDS on television. These are some of the people involved. Luc Montagnier from the Pasteur Institute in Paris. Peter Duesberg from the University of California, who argues that AIDS in North America is caused by toxic drugs, not by a virus. Joan McKenna, who says that AIDS is syphilis in disguise. Michael Callan, who has lived with full-blown AIDS for 11 years. Cass Mann from the British organization Positively Healthy. Dr. Joseph Sonnabend, who's been caring for people with AIDS since before the disease had a name, and journalist Celia Farber of Spin magazine. Frank Medema from the Red Cross Central Lab in Amsterdam, who says that the virus HIV most certainly does cause AIDS, but that AZT, the standard treatment, is a lousy drug. Michael Elner from New York, who argues that people with AIDS are being psychologically programmed to die. Nina Lopez-Jones from the English Collective of Prostitutes, who analyzes the political agenda behind the AIDS campaigns. And Robert Root Bernstein from the University of Michigan, whose research on the immune system suggests how the AIDS diseases might come about and what might be done to prevent them. The Amsterdam Symposium lasted 3 days, and I want to start in the middle. At issue is whether AIDS is caused by one thing, and thus might have one cure. The official answer is yes, AIDS is caused by one thing, and that one thing is the virus HIV. This answer is what you'd expect. Scientists are always trying to sort out complexity, to simplify the mechanisms of physics and chemistry and biology, to find the ultimate single cause.
In the 17th and 18th century, we invented a new root metaphor saying that the world is a machine. A machine is transparent, you can study a machine, you can predict a machine, you can control a machine. But more importantly, a machine has another characteristic. Every part of the machine is primarily in touch with one other part, and it has consequences for primarily one other part again. So there is a one-to-one cause and effect relationship, and most things in reality have one cause, so to speak, and one effect, remedy, therapy, or whatsoever. This way of thinking about the universe can still be found back in medicine of today. Things have one cause and there is one remedy. I think that reality is much more complex, and you said this afternoon, well, if you even have 100 persons with AIDS, it is possible that you have to look for 100 remedies. Well, that makes it possibly a little bit too complicated, and so that we can ask the question, are there some more or less general rules? And I picked up 5 points. The first point I heard was, don't believe your doctor, in the sense that he tends to believe in a very simple worldview. There is one cause and there is one remedy, AZT, so to speak, that may kill you. The second point was, try to ameliorate your general health. Sleep, food, no drugs, no antibiotics, and so on. Well, that can be done. Third possibility, or third point, is take exercise. There are indications in the United States as well as in Holland that exercise ameliorates general health, but also that it influences the immune system to a significant degree, and that the effect of exercise on the mind as well as the body has been grossly underestimated. The fourth point is that there are a great number of general psychological processes or attitudes that have a very, very significant influence on health and disease. Just one example, I didn't hear it this afternoon, but one example is this: total loss of social support is as serious a risk factor in lung cancer as smoking 40 cigarettes a day. They add up. People without any social support who also smoke have a fourfold or even eightfold higher probability of getting lung cancer. So complex diseases have complex causes, somatic causes as well as mental causes. And the other way around, you might speak that there is a biological reality that should be treated with biological means, by medication, whatever, global medicine, whatever it may be. On the other hand, we can also do much from a mental level. We know that in many serious diseases there is a complete list of characteristics of long-term survivors, not only in AIDS but also in cancer and so on. So the question is not what is the list, what are the characteristics of the survivors, but how could it be possible to change persons in that direction? What do you have to do to achieve that? That was also the fifth point,
and the last
in the sense that, and the last, okay, in the sense that psychological variables play a role, but what still puzzles me is we know much about it, but how is it possible to change people? What do you have to do to achieve that? Thank you very much.
That question will come up in our third program from the Alternative AIDS Symposium in Amsterdam. The cause of AIDS has been a puzzle right from the start. Drugs that attack the immune system were suspected, among them prescription antibiotics and amyl nitrate aphrodisiacs. All sorts of viral and bacterial infections were suspected. Then a single virus, HIV, was found. It attacked immune system T cells in the test tube, and evidence for it was found in the blood of people with AIDS. From then on, mainstream research into other possible causes was simply shut down. Nevertheless, a few people persisted, looking for other explanations.
We believe that AIDS is the expression of syphilis in a chemically immune-suppressed population.
What Joan McKenna means is that when your immune system is disrupted, syphilis you might have picked up before, sometimes without even knowing it, may start to kill you. The microbes of syphilis can hide away in the body and nothing shows up on the diagnostic tests. This is how Joan McKenna's group got suspicious that syphilis and AIDS were connected.
We decided we were going to do a data analysis. And we began from 1945 and we went back to the 1890s. And we took a look at the signs and symptoms for syphilis. And we made a tally of those signs and symptoms. We took all of the literature on AIDS from 1980, which is really when the initial literature began. Some memos had come out and that kind of thing. From 1980 through, at this point, 1984. We were just approaching 1984. Everything that had been done in the literature up through place we were in 1984. And to tally whether or not there was a correspondence. And what we found was, ordinarily when you try to do a data comparison, if you get 65% or more, it's assumed you have a match, that you have enough evidence to say there is massive correlation, if not identity, between these two phenomena. What we found is something you're never supposed to have. We had 100% match. And we said, oops, if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, is it a duck? We then called the California Department of Health and asked the question, how do you evaluate syphilis in an individual who is immune suppressed? Because all of the blood work requires a competent immune system. And that began us on the process of investigating serology, serological markers, the issues around serology, the problems with serology, and the particular problems of serology in any immune-suppressed population.
But so what if you had syphilis in the past? You got treated and got rid of it? Not necessarily. There's a very suspicious coincidence between the symptoms of syphilis and the symptoms of AIDS.
In 1984, Sandra Larson, chief of treponema research at the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia, said that she had been receiving calls for 2 years from physicians seeing individuals diagnosed with AIDS who had signs and symptoms for syphilis but who were, on the blood tests, non-reactive. And what should they do? And she said, I don't know what you should do. They're AIDS patients. They're going to die anyway. We said, well, what did you tell them to do? Well, she gave us the standard battery of tests to do and some other more exotic tests. So we turned around and we asked our population to be tested. Many of the physicians seeing these individuals refused to test them. They said, this is redundant testing. We know this man has had syphilis. We know his antibodies are going to be there. Why bother spending this money on the test? Why add this on? We said, because we don't know that that's true. In the case of those individuals who did go and get tested, we found that 70% of people with a history of syphilis who should have had serum scars, these are antibodies that are formed in your body when you've had an infection and should be there on follow-up, and they should be there pretty much forever, or unless you're on your, at death's door, that you should have those serum scars for the rest of your life, just like you have for hepatitis. If you have the antibodies for hepatitis, they tell you you had hepatitis at some point. If you have antibodies to measles, you had measles, In 70% of the cases that we saw on the first go-round, people with a history of syphilis, not just primary syphilis, often secondary, tertiary syphilis, multiple incidents of syphilis, had completely lost their serological markers. You could not tell them from someone who had never had syphilis. We reported this to the Centers for Disease Control, and the Centers for Disease Control said, well, there must be something wrong with your laboratory. Send us blood and we will do a confirmatory study. We sent them blood. They found the same thing that we had found. They turned around and they said, well, your people must never have had syphilis. We said, we have medical records, we have case reports, we have all the evidence that say these people had profound multiple syphilitic infections. Why would their serology disappear? And they said, we don't know, and you're the only one who's found this problem, so go away.
If your immune system isn't working normally, the blood tests for syphilis don't register. And if doctors can't find the disease, of course, they don't treat it. Not that the standard North American treatment is much good at curing syphilis anyway.
With the advent of penicillin, they thought the problem was taken care of. Because at least in terms of the primary presentations and the infectious stages of syphilis, penicillin apparently got rid of this. Or at least that's what the Centers for Disease Control, then it was the Center for Disease Control, but now it's the Centers for Disease Control, told the Public Health Service. In point of fact, and I have the Abbott Laboratory report on penicillin with me, the laboratories, the manufacturers never knew whether or not penicillin was bactericidal, meaning killing the bacteria, or bacteriostatic, immobilizing the bacteria for some period of time. From 1947 to 1960, we had primarily a use of aqueous penicillin in the treatment of syphilis, or procaine penicillin plus probenecid. In 1960, we did a number of very interesting things. First of all, we changed most of our testing. Secondly, we introduced benzathine penicillin, which is an oil-based, long-acting penicillin. In 1987, Great Britain refused to renew Wyeth's license for benzathine penicillin in the treatment of syphilis in Britain because in the socialized medicine's capacity to follow records, it had not proved effective in the treatment of syphilis. Yet in the United States, we continue to use benzathine penicillin as the primary treatment advocated by the Centers for Disease Control. Syphilis is an old enemy. It is one of the most profound infections you can have. Syphilis will kill you. There is no doubt about it. What has happened is that we have gotten a very cavalier attitude about this, and the world followed our lead. And it was the biggest mistake any of us made.
At the Amsterdam Symposium, there were other explanations for AIDS. People with AIDS almost always show evidence of HIV infection, but they have many other infections as well. This doesn't mean any of these microbes alone cause the immune dysfunction called AIDS. They may just be markers, indicators, signs that you've been doing something, taking drugs for fun or having blood transfusions, that's caused a lot of trouble.
If you look at other microbes in people who practice risk behavior, you find they're all there. All of your friends from the microbiology textbooks, rare or not so rare, are found in people who practice risk behavior. You find cytomegalovirus, you find even HTLV1, the first cause of AIDS. For those of you who have a long-term memory in AIDS research, that was in 1983, 4 science papers again by Dr. Gallo, HTLV1, a leukemia virus, retrovirus, was also the cause of AIDS, because it was very common in AIDS patients. Remember? Perhaps some of you remember. Cytomegalovirus, Don Francis, 100% correlation. The first paper, Gottlieb, found all AIDS patients had cytomegalovirus infection. That was then the cause of AIDS. Hepatitis virus, toxoplasmosis, mycoplasma, you name them, the whole microbiology textbooks are in people at risk for AIDS. Simply for one reason, not because they're causes, but they are markers of risk behaviors. And those homosexuals who are at risk for AIDS are the same ones that Mike Callan this morning described also. Those are the ones who had hundreds, sometimes even thousands of sexual contacts. That is, from a microbiological point of view, shopping around for microbes in the community. You pick up all the microbes, the rare ones and the common ones. It's like a stamp collector going to many stores, finally picking up the Blue Mauritius or whatever he was looking for. And the same thing is true for hemophiliacs. They are the most promiscuous of all, if you want so. They are delivered blood concentrates or pools that come from many donors. They get everything that's in the community. So if you want to look for a rare virus and claim a disease that occurs in any of these diseases on them, as has been done with HTLV1, with cytomegalovirus, and with HIV for AIDS, you can always find them.
Early in the epidemic, people were said to die of AIDS. Now you read in the obituaries that they've died of an AIDS-related disease, which is more accurate. Some of the microbes that Peter Duesberg just mentioned cause fatal diseases. But your immune system has to be broken first. It's that broken immune system that's called AIDS. By itself, that doesn't matter much, but the diseases that invade while the security guard is disabled are what kill you. More about that in a minute. The immune system is a recent discovery, or maybe it's actually an invention, just kind of a handy figure of speech that points to an enigmatic device wrapped in a shadow. Parts of the system have been described. How it works as a whole is, as they say, still under investigation. Here's a painless 2-minute crash course from immunologist Robert Root Bernstein.
Let me just begin by giving you an introduction to the immune system itself. What we have here, if I can handle all these different things. Essentially, AG is antigen. Antigen is anything. Do we have a? Oh, we do. Okay, we have antigen, which is any foreign material that introduced into the immune system will induce an immune response. We have antigen-presenting cells, macrophages usually, which will pick up the antigen and process it. It actually breaks it down, puts it on its cell surface in conjunction with a protein called MHC class II, major histocompatibility factors. MHC2 interacts with the CD4 protein. The CD4 protein is the same protein that HIV uses to enter T helper cells. When this conjunction of events occurs, this causes the T helper cells to clone, make many copies of those specific T helper cells. They produce lymphokines and other things which stimulate the macrophages, and this process then upregulates itself, becomes more and more active. At the same time, the T helper cells will interact through the same sort of set of interactions with antigen class II MHC on B cells. These are the ones that produce antibody. The antibody is going to run around and specifically try to eliminate that particular antigen. So then there'll be less antigen, less macrophages picking up antigen, and we will now lower the immune response if you're having an effective immune response. So essentially we have a series of cycles here which can both turn on the immune system and turn it off.
Antigens are things the immune system doesn't like, things like foreign bacteria and viruses. But the immune system can also decide that it doesn't like parts of the body itself. It's what happens in juvenile diabetes and arthritis, for example. The process is called autoimmunity.
Now, autoimmunity has several possible causes. As I say, there's no general agreement here, so this is going to be an interesting problem in trying to understand AIDS itself. First, we're going to have to figure out what autoimmunity is before we can figure out what autoimmunity in AIDS is. As I mentioned, because autoimmunity is so prevalent and there's so many forms in AIDS patients, in fact, AIDS may be the key to understanding autoimmunity, which might be good news not only for AIDS patients, but for many other people as well. The man who's seen here, who I'll call Mike, it's not his real name, eventually died of AIDS. And his symptoms included a very wide range of autoimmune processes which are not unusual in AIDS patients. Not surprisingly, in addition, Mike had autoimmunity against his own immune system. And this is one of the most interesting aspects of AIDS, because in AIDS, the immune system not only turns against various parts of the body, it frequently turns against itself. And this is characterized by the B cells, which produce circulating antibodies, producing antibodies that attack T cells and slowly but surely destroy the T cells. So, in a sense, part of what Mike died of, certainly, was an immunological civil war.
The antibodies produced by the immune system that end up eating the system alive can be triggered in a variety of ways. In hemophiliacs, for instance.
If you look at simply any group of hemophiliacs, you will find that many of them are immune suppressed. There are dozens of papers in the literature. There is a huge fight going on as to what causes this. Nobody's quite sure. Some people relate it to the amount of factor which is being used, some people to the disease itself, some people to the presence of lymphocytotoxic antibodies killing off the T cells and so forth. I simply want to mention that, again, there is no obvious correlation with HIV here. There are people who are HIV negative who are hemophiliacs who have lower T cell counts than people who are HIV positive. And this, again, is an interesting problem. We also have evidence of semen-induced lymphocytotoxic antibodies. In this case, very interesting studies done by a large number of people. Semen introduced anally or somehow into the bloodstream will produce antibodies. The body looks at these as foreign antigens, wants to get rid of it. These antibodies will cross-react, that is, they will recognize T helper cells just as they will recognize the semen itself. So that in getting rid of the foreign material, it initiates an autoimmune response.
Peter Duesberg argues that in North America, drugs are responsible for AIDS. You'd think he'd want to blame a virus, since he's one of the 3 or 4 leading experts in the world on retroviruses. He discovered the genetic map that describes them all. But because he knows so much about them, he's sure that no retrovirus like HIV could possibly cause AIDS. Since 1986, he's been an energetic critic of what he calls the dogma that the old virus HIV, spread by blood and sexual intercourse, is the cause of AIDS.
The only thing that's new is that we are now using chemicals even for sex. We are using chemicals in the Olympics and we run faster, and we're using chemicals in the bedrooms and we have break the old records there too. And it's the chemicals that puts you at risk, not the sex. The only thing that's new in America, in fact in the Western world, in terms of health threats, is the dramatically escalating consumption of recreational drugs, which started after the Vietnam War and has increased over 100-fold in the last 10 years alone in the United States. Here are the numbers. A third of all American AIDS patients and European AIDS patients are confirmed intravenous drug users. I do not have to convince you that they're using drugs. They're confirmed by the Centers for Disease Control. And it's hardly likely that these numbers are overreported, because drug consumption now and then is still an illegal activity, unlikely to be overreported, not like HIV. And we have to account for the male homosexuals. That's the largest group in America and Europe that is getting AIDS and is not generally believed or mentioned to be drug users. And I would like to point out, before I get criticized as a homophobe or heterophobe or biphobe or fascist or moralist or whatever it is, I want to point out that it's a very small fraction of gays or homosexuals who are at risk of AIDS. About 10% of the male population in America and Europe are homosexual. That's 8 million male homosexual Americans. Out of these, 20,000 annually develop AIDS. So we have to explain why 0.25% of the male homosexuals get AIDS and 99.75% do not get AIDS. Here are some of those correlations of homosexuals at risk for AIDS, risk behavior. This is an early study from the CDC before the deadly virus was even known. 170 at risk were studied. They were in venereal disease clinics. 50 of them actually had already AIDS, Kaposi sarcoma. 96% of these reported regular usage of nitrate inhalants, which are approved by the AIDS orthodoxy. The AIDS establishment does approve of drugs. That is a responsibility that they do have to share. They always blame me for being irresponsible. They say use clean needles. They are implying drugs are okay. It's a police business, but we are not the police. We are only concerned with your health. We are only concerned with your bugs. Make sure you use a clean needle to inject dirty drugs. Or to inhale poppers, that's totally cute. That's a symbol of gay liberation. We don't mess with that. We are politically correct. And here what's what we're getting. 96% of those with AIDS or at risk for AIDS inhale nitrate inhalants. The first mutagen ever to be known were nitrates, directly reacting with DNA, with RNA, with proteins, with hemoglobin, with vitamins, everything. And that's done on average for 10 years. That's the latent period of the deadly virus, remember? And here 30 to 50% have used acyl chloride inhalants. Perfectly harmless, you know, it's just like Chanel No. 5. Cocaine, 50 to 60% are using that one. That's also, of course, could possibly cause a disease. Everybody does it anyway. Amphetamines, phenylcyclidine, and this is all the same group. If you add that up, you could have a great party. And these are the diseases that go with it. 80% of them had gonorrhea, 40 to 70% syphilis, 50% hepatitis, 30% parasitic diarrhea, 15% mononucleosis. Here's a study from the famous San Francisco cohort, 1959. 84% of these 359 men, self-identified male homosexuals at risk for AIDS, had used this battery of drugs, and these were the diseases that corresponded with that activity. They always say, okay, if you blame drugs, do you have evidence that drugs are actually necessary? This is a study in HIV positives, drug users from Zurich. 2/3 were going off the drugs and 1/3 continued. Those staying on the drugs had 3 times the diseases for the following year than those without it. The last religion in the Western world is science. We trust our scientists 100%. And lately they turn out to be more and more human, to me sometimes even too human. But look what happened. That's the summary. 2 words is, well, about 15 words. All right? These are diseases which were diagnosed as infectious and they were all reduced to drugs. And this is my last silent slide.
Peter Duesberg's slide showed diseases that were misdiagnosed as coming from germs, when in fact something else was responsible. Scurvy, actually vitamin C deficiency. Pellagra, lack of vitamin B. Burkitt's lymphoma. Kuru in New Guinea. Cervical cancer. Subacute myeloptical neuropathy in Japan. For years a virus was blamed, but it turned out to be the fault of a prescription drug. And now, according to Peter Duesberg, AIDS. Next, the pros and cons of HIV.
When you go into your clinic, you are presented with a solid body of opinion that says this is it, this is Holy Writ. HIV causes AIDS, your only treatment option is AZT. And what happens is that the medical model we're working with, which does in fact jeopardize survival, is that HIV equals AIDS equals death.
At the Amsterdam Symposium, every part of this establishment equation was brought into question. Here's what I mean by establishment. This book lists every AIDS research project with government funding in Canada. There is not a single project investigating any other possibility than HIV equals AIDS. Both here and in the States, it's a question that's not open for official discussion or funding.
I believe that I personally will die before any therapies are found that could save my life. I believe that we have frittered away 10 years of my life, while people who were incredibly arrogant closed down debate and ruthlessly punished and censored people who had other very creative ideas. What I'm calling for is to reopen the question and to permit people who have other plausible explanations to receive funding and to be permitted to pursue treatment research based on their theory of what's causing the disease without having to somehow twist their theory to account for HIV.
For years, HIV was said to be a killer virus, acting alone, as fatal as being hit by a truck. Now it seems to need help, cofactors of some undefined sort.
In the asymptomatic phase of infection, there are slow-growing viruses, which are depicted here as open circles. In this phase of infection, individuals, although asymptomatic and having rather normal CD4 cell counts, their T cell function is already attenuated and will never be normal again. T cell function goes down and CD4 cells slowly decline, as I showed you for the NSI association. At some time, probably when the immune system is not able to control replication anymore, quickly growing viruses, sometimes in 50% of the individuals at least, of the SI phenotype develop, and this individual rapidly loses his CD4 cells and goes on to AIDS, as I described to you. In the other scenario, there are only open circles. In these individuals, even if their immune function is totally distorted and they have AIDS for years, we never see SI viruses coming. So it seems that these individuals have met a totally different virus.
Who knows? It's one theory among 600, but it ignores the nagging question everybody was asking in Amsterdam. Is HIV a cause of AIDS or only a consequence? Once your immune system goes haywire, lots of microbes see an opportunity for mischief.
What evidence is there that HIV itself is not an opportunistic infection? How can you prove that it's the prime mover instead of just a result? In other words, the more rapid replication being a result of the immune suppression.
Right. Apart from, they like the question. Apart from what discussion, which I don't go into between Montagnier and Raul Coutinho, I think your question will be, if this, in fact, I would go along and say these viruses are opportunistic viruses. Because you need a totally distorted immune system to get the SI viruses coming.
This was a stunning admission from a longtime AIDS researcher firmly in the establishment camp. Dr. Medema went on to address the puzzle of why immune system cells die right and left when so few of them are actually infected. The new buzzword is apoptosis, programmed cell death. It's not an explanation, really. It's just a name.
What could be the contribution of programmed cell death or apoptosis in infection? Of course, when T cells are programmed for death and you encounter a specific antigen, only 1 in 1,000 of the cells is specific for this antigen. And only 1 in 1,000 of the cells will die from programmed cell death. But there's a lot, and as we mentioned before, there's a lot of evidence now that there are super antigens. So in all kinds of systems, in humans, in mice, we know that super antigens may have a role in affecting the immune system. And a super antigen is an antigen that does not bind to 1 in 1,000 of the T cells, but can activate up to 15% of the T cells. And if a super antigen is in play, so it could be a bacterial or a mycoplasm protein, these proteins might easily hit about 15% of the cells, which could then lead to death of 15% of the cells. And that, of course, would have a major contribution to depletion and also T cell dysfunction. It has also been argued that HIV itself, some of its proteins might be a super antigen. And of course that would be a nice explanation, but there's no evidence yet for that.
The HIV theory has been twisted and twisted as more and more tough questions come up. In laboratory conditions, HIV can kill immune system cells, but in the body, only 1 in 10,000 T cells is actively infected. The body replaces them 100 times faster than HIV kills them.
The thing that most troubles me is the arrogance of the assertion of what are essentially hypotheses. I have been around long enough to have heard the Pac-Man model of T-cell killing and that it was only a matter of time until we confirmed it. I've heard a number of interesting theories about apoptosis and GP120, but as far as I can tell, they haven't been demonstrated to anyone's satisfaction. It's perfectly appropriate to propose them and research them, but you seem to suggest them with an arrogance that I find contemptible.
I think there's a fair degree of consensus that HIV is not necessary for AIDS. However, we still need to explain why HIV is there, because it is extremely highly correlated with what we are defining as AIDS. You can't just throw it out and say, well, it's not there, it doesn't play any role. We need to figure out why it's there, and if it plays any role.
We have now 3 cases of people which are HIV negative and show some strong signs of immune depression, very low CD4, and also opportunistic infections. But it seems that we are dealing there with an exception, which also is not very surprising. I would say in nature there are always exceptions. Doesn't mean AIDS is not caused by HIV. It means that in many cases AIDS is caused by HIV and perhaps some additional factors, and in a few cases there are some other factors.
Luc Montagnier, who discovered HIV and connected it to AIDS, now has another candidate. It's a poorly understood organism called mycoplasma. It was first proposed in 1986 by Dr. Shai-Ching Lo of the U.S. Army, who had an awful time getting his work published and then had it ignored. Dr. Montagnier took up the idea and presented it first at the 1990 AIDS conference in San Francisco, and he was ignored. But he's persisted.
The same type of virus, the same virus, depending on the host, can induce disease or no disease at all. And I think we have to explain this. This indicates that there are perhaps some host factor, not only the virus is important, but there are some host factors which are needed in order to induce the disease. Mycoplasma are bacteria without wall, and just this slide shows the size of those mycoplasma compared to 2 viruses, HIV and smallpox virus. And you can see that those structures are very large tubes, but they are very small in diameter, and they are small balls here, small spheres, which are about the size of viruses.
The search for cofactors to help HIV along is gaining momentum because the HIV alone theory never really explained AIDS. If you want to convince me that burning gasoline makes my car run, you can show me the engine. If I'm still unconvinced, you can take the engine apart and show me how its theory works out in practice. But this is nothing like the case with HIV and the immune system collapse that leads to the diseases of AIDS, where nothing of the mechanism can be demonstrated. Preventing or treating the diseases of AIDS is often possible. But what's happened is the big money has been spent on AIDS itself and its so-called treatment with AZT.
What is being treated? Now, when a person goes in and has AIDS, the best result has always been consistent if you deal with the infection or problem the person has. But what we're talking about, I hear, is treating AIDS. And I have never seen anyone benefit from AIDS treatment. If someone has PCP, that requires care. If someone has KS, that requires being addressed. If someone has toxo, that needs to be addressed. But if you say, well, I'm just going to address AIDS, you're doing them a terrible disservice. And I see no benefit. Over 150,000 people contact with, a real good sense of long-term survivors, a real good sense of the people who are staying healthy and what they're doing. And over again you see the people who are manipulated into treating AIDS do horribly. The people who are treated for what they're suffering from and the people who don't take treatment unless it's indicated, unless there's a problem, do the best. There's no question about that.
I think the role of the general practitioner will ever become more important. This is also an official tendency, for example, in Switzerland, to switch away from the hospital treatment to the treatment in the general practice. Now, this, however, means that we should have informed and critical general practitioners, which we don't. Now, how do we get information in general practice? One, mostly by the industry, 2, by our medical talks in hospitals, in seminars, which is about the same as 1, and 3, by reading ourselves. But reading what? Our patients are, as to AIDS, as for the critical aspects of the whole thing, fairly well orientated to some extent, but our doctors are not.
Doctors naturally want to use mainstream, tried and proven treatments whenever possible. In the case of AIDS, the mainstream treatment is to prescribe AZT and to keep on giving it until the patient dies. AZT has not cured a single patient, but ironically, doctors go on recommending it because otherwise, says Michael Callan, they might find themselves in a malpractice suit.
The threat of a malpractice suit is very real, but society rewards MDs very generously, and what comes along with the turf, you've got to make some choices. And as I understand it, the first principle is do no harm. And if you genuinely believe that what the mainstream standard of art and practice is will harm your patients, you must not prescribe it. The only mitigating defense that I could suggest, and I think ethically this would be fair anyway, what the doctors that I know do who don't prescribe AZT, they certainly make their patients aware that that's what other doctors are doing. They refer them to literature. They suggest that they talk to other people with AIDS who have made different choices. They don't play the other role of censoring mainstream science. They say, you should be aware that if you went to most other doctors, this is what they would prescribe for you in your condition. I am not recommending that, and here is why, but the choice is ultimately yours. It seems to me that you would be very much protected against a malpractice suit if you made it clear to the patient that the choice was ultimately theirs and made them aware of their alternatives.
In the next hour, we'll hear about some of those alternatives from the May Symposium of the Foundation for Alternative AIDS Research in Amsterdam. A printed transcript of all 3 hours in this Ideas on Camera series is available, and here's our address. It's Ideas, Box 500, Station A, Toronto M5W 1E6. The television transcript costs $8. For $5, you can get a transcript from Ideas on radio called What Causes AIDS. This CBC radio series by Coleman Jones won the 1991 award from the Canadian Science Writers Association as the best radio program of the year. Included in the radio transcript is a 355-item reading list that will keep you busy for months. Same address, Ideas, Box 500, Station A, Toronto, M5W 1E6. Suppose a close friend was told he had AIDS. What would you think he should do? That's one of the questions that led to the May Symposium in Amsterdam. It was put on by the Foundation for Alternative AIDS Research with money from the Dutch government. This meeting of dissidents was held in a church where centuries ago religious heretics found shelter from Orthodox Protestants. Treating AIDS and the 24 diseases that go with it is as much an art as a science. Many of the diseases can be controlled, but AIDS itself can't be touched. So what are the alternatives? Here are some of the people you'll hear in this program talking about the causes and cures of AIDS. Dr. Joseph Sonnabend, who's been caring for people with AIDS since before the disease had a name. Molecular biologist Peter Duesberg, who questions the assumption that HIV causes AIDS. Robert Root Bernstein, whose research on the immune system has led to new ideas about how AIDS works. Frank Medema from the Red Cross Central Lab in Amsterdam, whose work shows that HIV does cause AIDS. John Lauritsen, who says it's an awful mistake to use AZT as a treatment. Michael Elner from the New York organization HEAL. Cass Mann from the British group Positively Healthy. And Michael Callan, who's had AIDS for a decade. Maybe you're surprised that people do survive AIDS. These long-term survivors don't get much attention. People who die make the news. People who survive don't. This has a terrible psychological impact on people with AIDS and on everybody else. The mainstream theory is that HIV is the one and only cause of AIDS. This theory controls the kind of research that gets done worldwide. But the HIV theory is just that, a theory, plausible but undemonstrated. Nevertheless, it has an overwhelming impact on the way AIDS is treated.
This is my pill bag. There are, I take 56 pills a day, and I've had AIDS for 10 or 11 years, depending on how you count, and I am stabbing in the dark. I've made up these pills. There is no reliable scientific data to tell me which drugs, in what dose, on what dosing schedule, will keep me alive. To me, the most damning evidence that the HIV hypothesis has produced nothing of value for people like me is that we don't have answers to fundamental questions of what people can do to stay alive. Not only has it, in my opinion, not produced any therapies of value, but it has produced therapies that I believe are making people sick and shortening people's lives and ruining the quality of whatever time they have left on Earth. If I had to say one single reason why I think I'm still alive, it would be that my doctor, Joe Sonnabend, did something quite extraordinary. As early as 1982, he went to the library. It's radical and revolutionary, I know, but and he had had several patients in his practice die from pneumocystis pneumonia. Now, he had heard of the disease, but he was not expecting to see it in his Manhattan practice with young, vibrant men, 30s and 40s. So he typed in pneumocystis carini pneumonia and outspat an index called, one of whose entries was prevention and control. And he discovered that a Dr. Walter Hughes had published a placebo double-blind trial proving that 2 25-cent antibiotics taken daily can prevent pneumocystis in severely immunocompromised people. I have been on Bactrim since 1982, and I was personally a witness to the abuse that Dr. Sonnabend and a handful of other courageous physicians suffered for proposing that it made sense to try to give people medication to prevent what appeared to be the #1 killer of people with AIDS. I bring up prophylaxis because I am now, that's what these pills are. What I'm doing is I'm taking pills to prevent the five out of the 6 diseases that kill 95% of us. I'm prophylaxing against pneumocystis. I'm prophylaxing against fungal infections. I'm prophylaxing against toxoplasmosis. I'm prophylaxing against herpes, the entire herpes family. And I'm prophylaxing against the mycobacteriums. Those are the 5 of the 6, the 6th being, of course, KS, which I have, and lymphoma, which there are no prophylactic medications for. It simply makes sense to me to try to prevent the diseases that are most likely to kill me while scientists dally trying to find treatments for the underlying immune deficiency.
When it became apparent in 1982, 83, that the patients with AIDS were dying of pneumocystis pneumonia, why did not the same reasoning, the same common sense reasoning that they'd want to use prophylaxis having been proven in one group and another group, why did the same reasoning not apply to people with AIDS? We had the drugs. It's true that many people are intolerant to Bactrim, but there are many who are not. So why was not the same benefit given to people with AIDS that was given to a kidney transplant? And the AIDS medical establishment said, we have to do more studies. So that
Thank you.
I don't know why, but an additional reason may be just the sheer incompetence of the people who are leading the AIDS establishment.
If someone has PCP, that requires care. If someone has KS, that requires being addressed. If someone has toxo, that needs to be addressed. But if you say, well, I'm just going to address AIDS, you're doing them a terrible disservice. And I see no benefit. Over 150,000 people contact with, a real good sense of long-term survivors, a real good sense of the people who are staying healthy and what they're doing. And over again you see the people who are manipulated into treating AIDS do horribly. The people who are treated for what they're suffering from and the people who don't take treatment unless it's indicated, unless there's a problem, do the best. There's no question about that.
By treating AIDS, Michael Ellner means trying to get at the retrovirus HIV that's said to sabotage the immune system, the body's defense against infection. Over $1 billion has been spent to develop antiretroviral drugs like AZT and its new cousins, DDI and DDC.
Has too much emphasis been placed on antiretroviral drugs, antiviral drugs? The answer is emphatically yes, and the reason for that, I think, is that HIV has been accepted as the single cause, or the necessary, both necessary and sufficient for this disease, and if one believes that, it's totally appropriate to devote all one's treatment research resources towards trying to control HIV. However, by having done this, there are many, one should point out some of the areas that have been neglected in terms of treatment development. Firstly, there are the questions of the opportunistic diseases. There are opportunistic diseases for which there are terrible treatments at the moment. For example, the treatments for cytomegalovirus involve, as people probably know, the placing of an intravenous catheter and treatment with drugs that are exceedingly toxic. Why haven't we developed a non-toxic or much more manageably toxic oral treatment that would spare people the need of a catheter? We did recognize the importance of cytomegalovirus early. We have done virtually nothing to try and develop these treatments. Prophylaxis for the other opportunistic infections. The emphasis on antiretrovirals delayed the use of prophylaxis for PCP. I recall that Dr. Sam Broder, who brought us ACT, when the results of the trial done by Dr. Fischel, showing that Bactrim was an effective PCP prophylaxis, he said these results were mildly interesting and that it might help to keep people alive until an antiretroviral was developed. So there's no doubt that the emphasis on HIV has discouraged research that would have saved or prolonged the lives of people. So to that extent, it's really criminal. Many fruitful or promising treatments could have been developed. To the extent that they haven't been developed, people who might have been helped by these treatments have not been helped, and therefore one can see that the emphasis of on antiretrovirals has actually shortened the lives of people, let alone from the toxic effects of these drugs in question. So the answer is yes, there's been too much emphasis on antiretroviral drugs.
All of the studies I have looked at that claim benefits for AZT in one way or another have been no good. Sometimes simply sloppy and incompetent, sometimes manifestly fraudulent. Many of the studies were just little bits of nothing. A few patients in a totally uncontrolled study, which, is not even on the level of a good anecdotal report. AZT is now being given to people who are objectively healthy. There is nothing wrong with them aside from the fact that they have HIV antibodies. And so therefore, it is obviously of concern whether or not AZT will cause cancer. I maintain that we can say quite positively at this point that AZT is a known carcinogen. And we can do this from 4 different mutually supporting ways of reasoning. Number one, by its very nature, we would expect that AZT would cause cancer. The fact that it is a terminator of DNA synthesis. The fact that when AZT is taken into a cell, there are only 2 things which can happen. Either the cell dies, or if the cell is lucky, it mutates and you get cancer. That is lucky for the cell, but not lucky for you. The second reason is that according to a standard in vitro test to screen for carcinogenicity, AZT was highly active. It's called the cell transformation assay. And the FDA toxicologist who reviewed the results said, on the basis of this test, we should assume that AZT will cause cancer. The third line of proof is that AZT does cause cancer in rodents. And based on a century of animal testing for carcinogenicity, the way this should be interpreted is that anytime any substance has been found to cause cancer in animals, the assumption should be that it will cause cancer in human beings. There has been a lot of disinformation by Wellcome and also by the tobacco industry and others, where they say, well, only because it causes cancer in mice doesn't mean it will in people. This is not true. There are things that are species-specific, but on the whole, the assumption should always be, if it causes cancer in an animal, assume it will in people also. And the fourth line of proof is that we now see a strong correlation between AZT therapy long-term and various forms of cancer, especially cancer of the lymph system.
I have been pretty prominent in my opposition to the use of AZT. And I didn't expect to find similar opposition among the long-term survivors, but I did. It was pleasantly surprising. Of the 4 dozen, only 4 had ever used it at all, and 3 are dead and 1 is dying of AZT-induced lymphoma. The overwhelming majority of long-term survivors had somehow managed to resist the enormous pressure to take AZT. And I don't know how many have subsequently given into that pressure. This was people at the time of my interviews. But I would say to those of you people with AIDS in the audience, or those of you AIDS activists, that this was very much a distinguishing characteristic of long-term survivors, by which I mean a skepticism about experimental medications. My perception of a person diagnosed with AIDS in 1992 is that they would sell their grandmother into slavery to get a slot in the latest drug of the month clinical trial. There is a sort of fanatic drugs into bodies mentality that is driving a certain segment of AIDS activism. And in fact, long-term survivors, for what it's worth, take a very skeptical wait-and-see approach. I read somewhere in this whiny publication by the Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association, they were attempting to justify why they were price gouging with AZT, and they pointed out that 9 out of 10 drugs that ever enter any phase of human testing fail as either too toxic or non-effective. Well, that's to me quite startling if true. If the odds are stacked against you 9-1, then I do not understand this current drugs into body frenzy. My AIDS activist friends who are in the forefront of this drugs into body frenzy, I feel are very misleading to people with AIDS who are frightened and desperate. They only seem to talk about 2 possible outcomes to taking an experimental drug. One is that it works, and one is that it doesn't. There's a third, apparently much more common possibility, which is that you will be worse off than if you did nothing at all. And nobody likes to talk about that because it's so unpleasant, but from my reading of the literature, sometimes doing nothing is much better than doing the wrong thing. And it would seem, based on the track record of government-sponsored clinical trials, that most people are actually worse off taking these toxic drugs than if they hadn't started at all.
AZT is what's called a DNA chain terminator. It interferes with the fundamental life process of genetic replication. This interference hits the HIV virus, all right, but it affects other systems in the body as well. When people take AZT, they know they're taking it. Some people immediately feel invigorated. Others are swept with pain and nausea. In people who have the virus HIV but no symptoms, the drug seems to lengthen the time until they get desperately sick. But so far, there's no consistent evidence that it makes people live longer overall. And there's expert opinion that AZT's effect on the virus is really irrelevant. It could be its general antibiotic effect that matters, or, early on, the way it cranks up the immune system by actually harming the body.
It damages the bone marrow, that's obvious from the need of transfusions. About the gut influence, not much is known. But what happens there? You break down the cells, it stops DNA synthesis, and you liberate polynucleotides. And these polynucleotides are known to be potent immune stimulants since about 40 years. They have been used in sublethal irradiation of animals and restored the immune system astonishingly. And as long as polynucleotides as breakdown products of cells of the bone marrow, the immune tissue and the gut mucosa are available, you have a positive effect. An immune stimulation by endogenous breakdown within DNA synthesis. But when this endogenous pool of polynucleotides is gone and not replaced by oral input of polynucleotides, with yeast, with liver, with thymus and such things, then you come to the next phase when AZT is only toxic and the secondary effect of liberation of polynucleotides has faded away.
Of course, the higher dosages that were initially used did give a lot of bone marrow suppression, and certainly there are, with long-term use of AZT, you get a myopathy, and I've seen patients who improve tremendously when they stop AZT in a general sense of well-being. These patients exist, but also AZT does still have some benefits when people use it for a long period. And the most significant benefit is the prevention of AIDS dementia, which I find terribly important. It is absolutely true that AZT has reduced the incidence of AIDS dementia complex, and that's an effect of AZT that lasts much longer than the effect on the immune system.
But the data around AZT, they are very conflicting.
That's
and
true.
I think we have to be very honest about that.
Yeah.
In fact, can I just add one statement? When I went to the Wellcome Conference at London Zoo, appropriately, 2 weeks ago, it's true, I couldn't make that up. Dr. Trevor Jones, head of clinical research in the UK, actually admitted that it was an experimental drug. And they were doing they were trialing the drug to get data. The data don't already exist, so we are still in the process of data gathering. But what happens at clinic level is that we are presenting with concrete data, as though this was solid, it had bodies, man-years of research behind it. And I think we should be honest. A patient with HIV would be far happier and trusting of their doctor. The doctor said, I don't know the answer. This may be the option. Are you prepared to experiment with me? Instead of being told, this is it, this works, this studies prove that. Because you can produce 6 studies to prove it works and 6 studies to prove it doesn't. It's that conflicting. And honesty would be a good response.
I couldn't agree more with you.
Thank you.
Studies need to be decently done to answer the question as to whether there is a limited utility of AZT. All of us have seen people. I have to say that I think my views about AZT are reasonably well known, but I have to say that there are selected people who've put on weight, people who've lost their fevers, who've felt better on AZT. To deny this is completely dumb. This is, in a sense, anecdotal, but it's a beginning. Studies could be. I should just say one rational thing about AZT is we have recently found, others too, that AZT has the ability to lower the levels of serum plasma interferon, which are elevated in people with AIDS and which undoubtedly contribute to pathogenesis. Now, if AZT can do this, it seems to me this would be the basis for doing a clinical trial based on selecting people who actually have high levels and using AZT clearly for maybe a period certainly not to exceed 8 weeks. And maybe it could be repeated again. So if there is some benefit, we shouldn't throw away the possibility of using it in a rational sense just simply because the original studies were terribly performed.
And a contrary view now from Michael Elner, who wants to flush AZT down the toilet.
One person can drink urine, and you see a total remission. Another person can use Chinese medicine, and you see a total remission. Another person can pray, and suddenly they're in dynamic health. I have never seen that with AZT or retroviral therapies.
Okay, thank you very much.
Several people at the symposium jumped on Frank Medema, a prominent HIV researcher, arguing that it's the single-minded concentration on HIV research that's led to the concentration on AZT as the drug for AIDS.
There is no good drug. AZT is no good. It only helps in very few people, and it hurts a lot. We know that. Right. But if you now stop this type of research, then you are empty-handed, because there is no other good alternative, in my view. And I think, I don't know what other people...
Unless you've reached a dead end with it.
Well, the dead end is not there. I hoped to have convinced you that from the immunological point of view, but also from virology, the data I showed, a lot of other data is around that gives more and more understanding of how this process is taking place in an infected individual. So we are still learning a lot, and I think the last 2 or 3 years, together with new immunological insights, we have learned a lot.
So
and
you feel HIV research is still fruitful, it's still yielding answers that we haven't had? Okay.
A year ago, I could not have given a lot of these, a lot of the talk that I gave today, and I think I am still... This is my daily work, so I have still the feeling that we progress. And
Sir, you said you know that AZT is a bad drug, and you said we all know that. However, healthy seropositives are being high-pressured to use it with the misleading lie it will prolong their life. How do you respond to that? This is happening in a massive, high-pressure sales way. Doctors are pressuring, the media is pressuring, they're educating the prayers to put them on AZT, and you say it's not a good drug. Please respond to that.
Well, I fully agree with you. So there's no point in that. I fully agree with the presentation on AZT. We also saw those papers coming by, and everybody knows how difficult it is to prove that AZT does anything. And especially if you look 1 year later, then the effects mostly are gone in these studies. We all know that. That's no real secret. And I think it's no good to blame people who try to get insight into the pathogenesis of AIDS, to blame those people that AZT doesn't work. And that's what you now are trying to do. And it's also what was in the question of the lady. She said, well, AZT doesn't do anything, so you better stop. Are we to blame that AZT doesn't work? I don't think you should do that. I cannot respond to that.
No, but you missed my point.
No, I don't miss your point. We agree that AZT is a lousy drug, and we have to fight and fight to find better drugs. We agree on that.
Most people at the Amsterdam conference thought that the monocausal hypothesis, which says that HIV is the one single cause of AIDS, was the main stumbling block that's holding up progress in AIDS research. Robert Root Bernstein, the immunologist from Michigan State University, has another view. His concern is that the very way the HIV theory is being researched prevents the theory from being disproved or falsified.
I don't think it's the monocausal hypothesis itself that is creating the problem. Science properly done, it doesn't matter what your hypothesis is. If you lay out the hypothesis properly, you set up the experiments properly, you should be able to falsify your own hypothesis, come up with the anomalies and data which will find the things that don't fit, tell you what the new problems are, and tell you you need a new theory. It's not the fact that they have figured out, or they think they figured out, that it's HIV that is standing in the way. It is the fact that they are doing bad science. They have not set up a hypothesis in a way that they can falsify it. They are not doing the experiments that can falsify their own position. They are not looking for the anomalies that tell them that it doesn't work. Nor are they allowing anyone else to do those experiments. That's what's standing in the way.
At the Foundation for Alternative AIDS Research Symposium in Amsterdam, participants often disagreed with each other as strongly as they disagreed with the mainstream view that HIV is the sole cause of AIDS and AZT is an appropriate treatment. A major dispute developed over the issue of using condoms to prevent the spread of AIDS. Everybody agrees that condoms are good to prevent the spread of venereal disease. But Peter Duesberg, among others, thinks that AIDS is not a venereal disease and is not spread by sexual intercourse. The HIV virus, according to Professor Duesberg, who knows as much about retroviruses as anybody on Earth, can't be the cause of AIDS, no matter how many people with AIDS happen to harbor the virus. Besides, he says, there's so little active virus in semen that it would take a miracle to transmit it that way, or if not a miracle, then at least 1,000 sexual contacts.
There is no free virus around to pass on, even with wild sexual activities. The virus is neutralized by antibody. There is one virus in 8,000 cells, and that virus is dormant. They have analyzed semen with the polymerase chain reaction just half a year ago. Totally new data. They found in 25 men who are antibody positive at a sensitivity that detects one virus in 1,000 cells, semen cells, that includes sperm and blood cells, whatever may be in there, in 1 out of 25 men. All of them antibody positive, one provirus per million cells. That tells you, in other words, they detected one provirus in 25 million cells. That was pushing it to the limit of detection. That virus isn't even active. That explains why it takes 1,000 sexual contacts.
There are two basic lines of research that suggest to me that safe sex is necessary. Okay, one, there have been a number of nicely controlled studies where they have looked at condom use, safe sex practices of all types among homosexual men. For example, there's a study in Denver, Colorado, in the United States, a fairly closed community. They're able to identify a large number of the homosexual population. They've done widespread analysis of how many people are using condoms, what kind of sexual practices over many years. And with the introduction of safe sex practices, the rate of HIV transmission went down. Again, as I say, I don't care what the role of it is. It's a good marker for the probability of getting AIDS. That's gone down. STDs went down of all types. And AIDS cases are starting to go down. Okay, this is tremendous. This has not been duplicated everywhere. But in most cases, we don't know really how many people are using condoms. We don't know how many people are doing what type of sexual activities. New York City is just too big to be homogenous. People can do anything they want, so you can't expect this to work everywhere for every person. But it does work for some people, and certainly in some communities. The second basic evidence comes in part from my own research and other people's research that I've read about. Joseph Sonnabend, other people have found that there are anti-semen antibodies in a large proportion of gay men, particularly those at highest risk for AIDS, particularly the AIDS patients themselves. You don't develop anti-semen antibodies unless the semen is in your body and gets into the bloodstream or the lymph. Clearly, if you wear a condom and you don't transmit the semen, it's not going to get into bloodstream, it's not going to get into your lymph, you can't develop the anti-semen antibodies. The importance of that is that the anti-semen antibodies have been found to actually attack T cells and kill off the same T cells that are depleted during AIDS. So again, whether this is a cause, whether it's simply another factor that helps to create the AIDS, it doesn't matter. It's something that can be eliminated.
Peter Duesberg is getting famous for insisting that AIDS is not caused by the virus HIV, but instead by risk behaviors, including the immoderate use of all kinds of drugs, cocaine, amphetamines, narcotics, inhaled aphrodisiacs, steroids, even penicillin, by repeated infection with bacterial and viral diseases, including venereal diseases, by malnutrition, but especially in North America, by toxic drugs. The symposium itself generated a dozen stories in the British press focusing on the Duesberg theories. In response, some participants in the symposium felt it was necessary to issue a press release.
We wish to make it emphatically clear that we do not share Dr. Duesberg's view that safe sex practices are irrelevant to the spread of AIDS. There is absolutely no doubt that condom use is one critical element necessary to control the spread of this disease. While we acknowledge the important contribution Dr. Duesberg has made in reopening the question of the role of HIV and AIDS, his outrageous assertion that safe sex is irrelevant to the spread of AIDS is appalling and may kill people. Whatever the cause of AIDS, the dynamics of its acquisition clearly indicate that the proper use of condoms is one of the best weapons we have in the war against AIDS.
That statement was issued, more or less by accident, on official conference letterhead. Several hours later, in response, another group of participants issued this.
We, the undersigned, condemn the attack on the integrity of Peter Duesberg and his right to speak the truth as he sees it. In the case of risk reduction guidelines, almost total emphasis has been placed on safer sex, whereas drug addicts have been given the message that drug use is all right so long as the needles are clean. Gay men have not been warned about the dangers of recreational drug use, including poppers, nitrite inhalants, a highly hazardous drug sold legally in Amsterdam and London. Professor Duisberg supports safer sex in preventing venereal diseases and unwanted pregnancies, but believes that safer sex cannot prevent the spread of AIDS. We object to the inflammatory language of the press statement released earlier today, which included the grave assertion that Duisberg's ideas, quote, may kill people. Peter Duisberg is a man of great integrity who has been in the front line of combating the AIDS orthodoxies, which have caused and continue to cause so much death and suffering. He has a right to his opinions.
In the absence of certainty about causes and cures, here's what some of the people in Amsterdam said.
The crucial point, I think, that is, before we get to the consensus, before we get to the year study necessary to prove, it's good that we prevent already from now these possible causes of immune suppression or not. What we lose if we have precaution and we prevent already, and when will come the consensus, will confirm or deny this precaution. We have preventive now HIV infection. There are a lot of controversy about HIV, but still we have to prevent until we have solid, unequivocal proof to confirm or deny HIV. In the same way, I think that is very important that we prevent all these specific cofactors related to practice at high risk for AIDS. I not mean prevent if you smoke, because all people, a lot of people smoke and they don't get AIDS, or a lot of people drink and they don't get AIDS. Only to avoid these causes, specific causes related to practice at high risk for AIDS. From now, I don't think that we lose anything, and we can prevent possible some damage.
Luca, thank you.
Obviously, you don't want to get HIV. We don't know whether it's the cause or not, but you don't want to get it. You also don't want to get any of the possible cofactors, of which there are many. These could be cytomegalovirus, Epstein-Barr, so forth. Yes, we are all exposed to those, as Peter Duisberg says, but very few of us have active infections. We're not sure what triggers it, but clearly repeated exposure to somebody who's actively infected can restart the infection, because they've shown that with blood transfusions. So you don't want to expose yourself to people who are actively infected if you can help it. People who are actively infected are people like other full-blown AIDS patients. That means you have to be worried about safe sex practices. You want to use those. Those may be very effective not only in stopping the HIV, but other infections as well. Blood transfusions, many doctors, and I hear them say this over and over again, that the blood supply is safe. It is not safe. There are still people who are transmitting HIV through it. There are still people who are transmitting cytomegalovirus, hepatitis viruses, and so forth and so on through it. If you need blood transfusions, you should get the blood from somebody you know or self-donate. That's a lot safer. Drugs, don't use them if you don't have to. I mean, there are mental reasons, all sorts of reasons people will use drugs. Obviously, the less you use, particularly the recreational and addictive drugs, the better off you are.
I'm going to take a risk here. I've been around a long time, and I've known thousands of people with AIDS, and one of the earliest people with AIDS that I knew who died in 1982 was named Bobby Bloom, and on his deathbed, he said, being gay doesn't make you sick, it's being a pig about it. That was the kind of street wisdom that cannot be said, because we've got a lot of enemies and a lot of right-wing nuts who simply want to say, you got what you deserve, now crawl off and die. But among ourselves, we have got to be willing to speak frankly about components of certain lifestyles that might not be good for your health.
Finally, back to a fundamental question. It's not why do people die of AIDS? It's why have some been able to survive?
I'm going to list a few cofactors that might surprise a few people. And I think these cofactors are probably more lethal than any chemical or pathogens that are normally considered cofactors, such as CMV, EBV, etc. One of the main cofactors I feel escalate people who are antibody positive to developing AIDS or expecting to develop AIDS and then die are other people. Other concepts, the concepts in which HIV and AIDS are held, the expectations they have. I believe before something exists physically, it exists mentally. You inform your body by the concepts you have about progression or about the way you expect to live or die. So I would say the main elimination of cofactors we ask our members to do is to get rid of people that aren't supporting them in their choices, to not belong to organizations that are programming them to die. All the smart counseling work in AIDS, which I think is programming people to die, is based on death, dying, bereavement models. And that, to me, is one of the biggest causes of AIDS mortality in the group I work with, which is a limited group, and I do admit that it's gay men.
I don't know whether it's true here, but in America there's Elizabeth Kubler-Ross is very popular, and everybody is an instant expert on dying, and there are 5 stages, and people will constantly treat you as if you are in one of the stages, usually denial. If you talk about maybe sticking around longer than the 18 months allotted to you, people will look at you and say, yeah, sure. And long-term survivors were militant about it. They simply wouldn't put up with it. They spoke very movingly about needing to surround themselves with people who would support them in their hope. Interestingly, another thing that everyone mentioned was that knowledge of another long-term survivor was crucial to them maintaining their own belief in long-term survival. And that's really not so mysterious when you stop to think about it. If you set out to do something that no human has ever done, it's a different experience than if you set out to do something that few humans have done. You know that it can be done. And so knowledge that there were other long-term survivors was listed as very important for the long-term survivors. The reason that that's problematic is that a lot of long-term survivors are not public. What often happens, and certainly has been the case with me, is that people are so threatened by your survival that they find some way to say that you must not really have had AIDS to begin with, since everyone knows everyone dies of AIDS. If you didn't die of AIDS, then you must not really have had AIDS. And there really aren't very many advantages to standing up and saying you're a long-term survivor. You get a lot of abuse. And in my own case, I have been subjected to, I've received Nazi letters and death threats and been spit on the street, and Christian fundamentalist letters, and a lot of hate letters from gay people. It hasn't been fun. But I've continued to be public primarily because other long-term survivors consistently mention that it is important for long-term survivors to know of the existence of other people.
All we can say within the 10 years of AIDS discussion, there have been 9 to 15% of all HIV positives who have become AIDS sick. But it means at the same time 85 to 91% have not. And we are not ever looking at them.
We need to know who the people are who don't get AIDS, and we need to know who the HIV positive people are who, 1, do not develop AIDS, and 2, like Michael Callan, the people who develop AIDS and are alive for a long time. We don't have a good study of who survives, or in some senses, in cases, never gets AIDS. Why not? And it's absolutely ridiculous that we don't have that information. I would put that as the very first priority. That's the thing that we could do that would save more lives almost instantaneously than anything else.
In the next installment, we'll hear about the politics and the psychology of the AIDS epidemic, and why the single killer virus model is so attractive, even if it's wrong. All this from the May Symposium of the Foundation for Alternative AIDS Research in Amsterdam. A printed transcript of the complete 3 hours in this Ideas on Camera series is available, and here's our address. It's Ideas, Box 500, Station A, Toronto M5W 1E6. The television transcript costs $8. For $5, you can get a transcript from Ideas on Radio called What Causes AIDS? This CBC radio series by Coleman Jones won the 1991 award from the Canadian Science Writers Association as the best radio program of the year. Same address, Ideas, Box 500, Station A, Toronto M5W 1E6. Tomorrow in Amsterdam, thousands of experts on AIDS will begin their annual get-together. It's the 8th International Conference on AIDS. Scientists and reporters from all over the world will be there. In contrast to this, 8 weeks ago, there was another conference in Amsterdam organized by the Foundation for Alternative AIDS Research. The people at that conference knew they wouldn't be able to get a word in edgewise at the official conference, so they had one of their own. This program is the third and concluding one we're broadcasting from the Alternative Conference. There will be 128 scientific sessions at the official conference next week. Just one of those sessions will be devoted to alternative and traditional therapies. The other 127 are based on the mainstream consensus that HIV equals AIDS equals death. In the first two programs in this series, we heard people argue that HIV by itself is not the cause of AIDS. Other candidates include syphilis, repeated exposures to antigens and infections, and toxic drugs, both prescribed and illegal. The mainstream view is that there's only one cause, the killer virus HIV.
The HIV dogma is one of the main bases for the tremendous anxiety and fear which goes along with AIDS. The HIV positives are made to believe that when it comes to the truth, they actually don't have a chance anymore. And all yet HIV negatives are made to believe that one of the most important aspects of modern human relationships is protection.
It's been argued that the HIV theory gains much of its strength from political considerations, not scientific ones. In North America and Europe, most of the people who've gotten AIDS have been at the margins: homosexual men, junkies, and now, more and more, the poor. Outcasts felled by a viral Grim Reaper. There's also been a concerted effort to drag prostitutes into the AIDS equation.
This year, the police came out with another thing, which was that 40 out of 50 prostitute women in King's Cross, which is the red light area where we are based, were either HIV positive or had AIDS. When we asked where that was, of course, reported in the media uncritically, when we asked where they were getting this information from, they said it was only one policeman who had circulated some questionnaires. The policeman was not named. He was not working at that police station anymore, so nobody knows who the man is. But the police said that they had a duty to educate the public by giving out this information which is totally false from all other research that has been conducted and by and large has not had wide publicity because the media has not been that interested in it. Prostitute women do not have higher rates of HIV or AIDS than any other women. The HIV virus theory has been very useful to the right wing, and it is not an accident that the AIDS industry has flourished under the Reagan-Bush administration, a time of increased poverty and war for many. In addition to the drugs companies making money, it has been useful to the introduction of repressive legislation like immigration controls, anti-gay laws, laws against sex workers, and to creating a climate of fear.
The idea of a killer virus that's sexually transmitted was congenial to many different groups, groups that didn't necessarily like each other. For example, those proponents of family values were rather delighted with the notion that extramarital sex would be lethal. So that would be one kind of influence. Another situation is that if adverse social circumstances, poverty, somebody brought this up the other day, actually play a role in the sense of overcrowding, unsanitary conditions, and the promotion of the spread of other infections, the idea of a single killer agent allows you not to even look or not to examine these social circumstances or the influence of the factors that come from our own economic policies. Yet another thing which is really not medical is a kind of public fascination with high tech. I think when these scientists show their gels and their pictures, people somehow get bemused with this and they think it's kind of attractive. Another factor is that there's probably a public view that if a disease has a single cause, then the word vaccine is there, a single treatment, it provides a simple solution. So all these things are kind of disparate, but I think the proponents of the HIV or the single killer virus had to market their ideas. Bob Gatto is a good salesman. Not only that, he has a staff of media relation people who get in touch with the press and they sell these ideas. The selling of this idea was helped by the factors that I mentioned, and these are entirely non-medical, non-scientific things, but I think drove the easy acceptance of the killer virus model.
One thing that I would like to say is from a purely scientific point of view, a single agent or single ideological agent type of approach to AIDS was not stupid. I think we have to go back. It's very easy to say Bob Callow is stupid, Montagnier is stupid, all this kind of thing. It is a logical thing in science to go for the simplest hypothesis. So let's realize that this was the simplest hypothesis. Again, the mistake is not to look at what doesn't fit. And there's a lot that doesn't fit. And there were a lot of, as Joe Sonnabend already said, there were hints right from the beginning that things didn't fit. What we should have done is followed up all of those things, and I think absolutely the politics has had a lot to do. There's one other thing that hasn't been mentioned, which is literally the academic, the way the academic institutions now work. To get to the point where you have your own laboratory, to get your postdocs, to get your graduate students and so forth, you must have funding. Okay, I'm one of the very few people who has never had a government grant at my institution, and people told me I would never get tenure. I even started my AIDS research before I had tenure. I mean, this is like cutting your throat. But if you're good enough, you can do it anyway. I mean, that's essentially what my case and various other people's cases show. You can get away with it, but very few people do. The easiest way is to conform. And that means you do what everybody else wants you to do. So it's not just the government who's putting the pressure on. The entire university system has bought into, we want government money, we want to fund our overhead, and all that kind of stuff. So they've bought into the criteria as well.
25 years ago, when I edited the International Journal of the Addictions, we saw heroin addicts in New York that had the same symptoms and fatal diseases that people with AIDS have today. And this was years before AIDS and HIV were known.
Intravenous drug users are getting sick, really, in the same ways they were getting sick 30 or 40 years ago, which is to say they have lung disease, one of the various forms of pneumonia or tuberculosis, and they waste away. This is the syndrome of an intravenous drug user many decades ago. And in New York City, Dr. Polly Thomas, who is one of the members of the New York City Health Department, has said that if you had an intravenous drug user with tuberculosis and wasting, to know if this was an AIDS case, you would have to give the HIV antibody test. If the individual had HIV antibodies, they would be called an AIDS case and counted as an AIDS case. And the assumption would be that HIV had done it, that HIV made them sick. However, someone with the identical clinical profile, if they could not find HIV antibodies, they would say, well, it's just one more junkie with pneumonia or tuberculosis.
Those of us who worked with drug addicts before the days of HIV, I'm talking about back in the 60s, late 60s and 70s, in the United States and United Kingdom, and especially here, were perfectly well aware that heroin addicts, even without other drugs, became emaciated, became immunosuppressed, developed opportunistic infections. In fact, some of them get into a syndrome very like AIDS, 10 or 12 years before AIDS was ever mentioned. So there's no doubt about that. And the only surprising thing is that there's so much argument about it. There can be no doubt about it.
But the orthodox view about AIDS, no matter who has it, is this.
In order to explain the AIDS epidemic, you have to think of an infectious agent.
But the trouble is, AIDS doesn't act like an infectious disease.
Now, how can we tell whether AIDS is infectious or not? Well, in science, anyway, you can only work based on the past. And here are the criteria of infectious diseases in the past. All infectious diseases I have ever heard of, and I could find in the textbook of microbiology. They have certain things in common. All infectious diseases, venereal or not, spread randomly between the sexes. Tuberculosis, syphilis, diarrhea, hepatitis, you name them. You can always find a little risk, particularly if you reduce it to 1 or 2, that it's only male or only female. But if you look at population statistics, you'll find they always spread randomly in the population. That is what you would expect from a conventional infectious disease. All infectious diseases cause primary symptoms within weeks or months after infection. And the reason for that is very simple. Microbes are self-replicating toxins. It's not like cocaine or LSD or cyanide. You don't have to adjust the dose to a lethal or sublethal dose. The microbe does it for itself. It just takes one microbe. If you are susceptible or to it an acceptable host or hostess, that is, then that thing will replicate exponentially. If it's left alone, it will claim the 100 liters of human pus within a couple of days. And if it's not left alone, that is, if the immune system comes in, the fun is over within days or weeks. And if the immune system is very good, it stops it before you even notice it. If it's intermediate, you get sick. And if it's not there, you're dead, my friend. That's how it is with microbes and us. Now, another common characteristic of infectious diseases is that in all infectious diseases, all, no exception again, except of course HIV, there's a common active and abundant microbe in all cases. It's never latent. When it's latent, it's asymptomatic. That's how almost a large number of microbes, viruses and bacteria survive in nature. Like lambdaphage initially, they're passively replicating, inactive in the host. They have the potential to kill it in a minute. But when they're latent, they want to hang in there, passively replicating. One strategy of survival, another one would be to be very active. But when they cause disease, they always have to be active, because you see, a microbe is very small, can only handle one cell at a time, and we are 10 to the 14 cells. To get sick, you have to claim a certain amount of host territory. It's exactly like you want to invade a country with soldiers. You can't get even Holland with 10 German or American soldiers. Even if they are best equipped soldiers, they wouldn't even come close to Amsterdam. They would knock them out in the airport somewhere. But if 2 divisions come over, well equipped with General Schwarzkopf, Holland may be in trouble. So that is what it takes to cause a disease. You have an equivalent amount of microbes attacking a significant percentage of critical cells, and then can you get a disease? And only then, no exception, except of course HIV. Now, all common microbes can actually be diagnosed without using the polymerase chain reaction or nucleotide sequencing or fancy antibody tests or any other in vitro in vivo tests that we have developed with high biotechnology in the last 10 years. Robert Koch or Louis Pasteur could have diagnosed rabies or tuberculosis without the polymerase chain reaction, simply from looking at the symptoms that the microbe causes. A given microbe causes one or a few characteristic diagnostic, as we say, symptoms.
If AIDS doesn't act like other infectious diseases, then why is there such a strong belief that it is infectious and is caused by HIV? Well, the argument boils down to guilt by association. The virus and AIDS appear together. People with HIV, sooner or later, get sick with certain diseases.
We followed 700 homosexual men for 7 years, all of them HIV negative. We did not find a single indicator disease, PCP of Kaposi sarcoma, after 7 years of follow-up. We found, on the other hand, that of those people who seroconverted, that after 7 years, 30% had an indicator disease. I can tell you that is statistically a strong difference.
Starting out in '84, when we started to embark on this type of research with all of us here, the real enigma was how to solve immune deficiency when so few cells are infected. And I think that recent insights in immunology, and I tried to make clear that they are really recent, and also Dr. Montagnier has shown similar results, that now we are beginning to understand how the immune system as a network is functioning, that indeed when you make a cut or when you interfere with one of the pieces of the network, that could only be in 1 in 1,000 cells, but still could affect a lot of cells which are downstream in the cascade, if you understand what I'm trying to say. So cells which are later on in the cascade dependent on the primary cell, if that primary cell is attenuated or affected by HIV infection, all these other cells are suffering. I think there's a lot of evidence now coming in the literature very, very soon. And this is not only a topic for alternative AIDS research, but it will be one of the main topics in the July meeting coming up in Amsterdam.
Dr. Medema's theory is the latest in a long line of imaginative ideas that have been put forward to support the single killer virus model. Incidentally, he and Dr. Coutinho and a number of others were at the Alternative AIDS Symposium for an interesting reason. The Dutch government wouldn't support this alternative meeting unless it also made time for the balancing views of the orthodox scientists. When somebody has a broken leg, what you see is a broken leg. But when somebody has AIDS, AIDS is not what you see. What you see are one or more of the 25 diseases that come on top of the underlying problem. Or is it one underlying problem? Joseph Sonnabend says yes. In between whatever triggers the illness and that tornado of diseases that finally appear, there is a consistent entity, an immune disorder, a single ghost in the machine. Peter Duesberg finds this hard to believe. Here are their reasons.
One needs only to look at a blood picture from an individual with AIDS, and I think with good probability, without knowing anything else, I think a clinician will be able to say, from looking at the blood picture, from the white count, from the immunoglobulins, from the T cells, that this is very likely to be, I'm not saying with total certainty, but that this is very likely to represent the blood of a person with AIDS. So just simply in a practical sense, I believe it is indeed a single entity, the manifestations of which are variable. The opportunistic manifestations will depend on geography, will depend on what kind of organisms you have in you already that can be reactivated, but the underlying situation, I think, is uniform.
The AIDS diseases fall broadly into two entirely different groups. The microbial diseases, which are consistent with immunodeficiency, and the non-microbial diseases, which have nothing to do with immunodeficiency whatsoever, at least not until AIDS came around. Remember, science has changed since AIDS dramatically. But here are the microbial AIDS diseases. 50% in America are pneumonias, said to be due to pneumocystis pneumonia, which everybody in this room has right now in his or her lungs. It's a ubiquitous, relatively and totally harmless microbe, provided your immune system is normal. Candidiasis, again, ubiquitous, harmless thing. Mycobacterial diseases, toxoplasmosis, cytomegalo, and herpes, altogether 62% of the American AIDS cases are microbial diseases. In Europe, it's 75%. They don't break it down. The remaining 38%, and that's not a small percentage, in America, 19% wasting disease. That's a cell loss or weight loss compared to similar to anorexia or the weight loss that you experience in cancer. And it's specifically defined as not due to bacterial or enteroviral or bacterial infections. 10% Kaposi sarcoma, 6% dementia, 3% lymphoma. None of these diseases have anything to do with immunodeficiency. That isn't to say they couldn't coincide with immunodeficiency. You could have syphilis, tuberculosis, cancer, and a bullet in your leg all together. And those would certainly be cofactors of AIDS, all of them. They would be all cofactors of each other. But none of these diseases is caused by immunodeficiency. And virtually the same percentage in Europe. So all of this would have to be explained. Now, the African AIDS diseases, I pointed out, are clinically different. They are fever, diarrhea, tuberculosis, and slim disease. Those together add up to 90% of the African AIDS diseases. They do not overlap a lot with the European and American AIDS diseases at all. That's the microbial AIDS diseases. The overlap is less than 10%. Tuberculosis is 3% in America, and it's depending on the paper, 10 to 30% in Africa. Pneumocystis pneumonia, the predominant microbial disease in America, is hardly to be found in the first 90% of the African AIDS diseases. So we are talking about clinically and epidemiologically two totally different epidemics. And we also have to explain, if we want to find the correct hypothesis for the cause of AIDS, why different risk groups have very different AIDS diseases. For example, male homosexuals are 20 times more likely to have Kaposi sarcoma than intravenous drug users or hemophiliacs from New York. That's in New York City. It's not that we have different geographical parameters, or malaria in one part of the city and candidiasis in the other. No, in the same city, an HIV-infected male homosexual is 20 times more likely to have Kaposi sarcoma than the intravenous drug user or the hemophiliac. Dementia is primarily observed in long-term intravenous drug users, and the tuberculosis isn't strictly, but often seen again in intravenous drug users, and there are geographical differences that are already pointed out. If you have AIDS in Africa, you have these diseases. If you have AIDS in America and Europe, you have those. And the argument that these parasites are more common in Africa than in Europe may be true for some, but certainly not for pneumocystis pneumonia. Pneumocystis pneumonia is ubiquitous in Africans and Americans alike. So if immunodeficiency caused by the deadly virus and pneumocystis pneumonia were the combination to give you AIDS, pneumonia, the incidence should be exactly the same in America and in Europe, and it is totally different. It's not even close. So here, retrovirus is blamed for totally different epidemics, 25 different diseases held together only by the virus AIDS hypothesis. And that is an important thing to keep in mind. This hypothesis became the only definition of AIDS. There is no other definition. When you have any one of these 25 different diseases in two different epidemics, in two different continents, diarrhea in Africa, dementia in San Francisco, or Kaposi sarcoma in Los Angeles, you have AIDS only when you find HIV. That is the only basis for AIDS. That is the basis for the definition. Here is the definition of AIDS. For those of you who have forgotten it, it's relatively simple. If you have tuberculosis and HIV, then you have AIDS. If you have tuberculosis minus HIV, you have tuberculosis. If you have dementia and HIV, you have AIDS. If you have dementia minus HIV, you are stupid. Yeah, well, this sounds like a joke. This is the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, the National Academy, the Institute of Medicine. Very respectable people. That's the only definition they offer. I'm just giving you their data. I'm not making that up.
Don't be fooled by Professor Duisberg's entertaining manner. He knows as much about retroviruses as anybody alive, how they work, what diseases they cause, and he's a serious scientist. And his persistent arguments against the killer virus theory, using evidence from virology, from epidemiology, and from clinical research, have begun to have an effect. In a moment, the psychological impact of AIDS and what people have done to survive it. At the Alternative AIDS Symposium in Amsterdam, this question was asked. What does it mean to be diagnosed as HIV positive, when the conventional wisdom is that HIV equals AIDS equals death?
To describe this in terms of stress is misleading. We are talking about intense and chronic distress. We are talking about issues that are fundamental. Can a person be frightened to death? What do we know about hypnotic models such as bone pointing, where in cultures right now today, a shaman or a witch doctor points a bone and healthy people go home and die? Are we looking at electronic bone pointing in the case of HIV? In my opinion, HIV, not AIDS, but HIV disease is a disease of panic and expectation. The expectation is I'm going to get sick and die if I believe in that equation. Now you have to understand, most people, even if they are moved to maybe think that Professor Duisberg is correct, or Professor Bernakis, or Ruth Bernstein, it's not simply whether they believe in HIV or not. It's whether they believe in technology or science itself. Right now, the CDC is looking to terrorize people based on T-cell counts, using this marker as an indication of AIDS. And yet, we continuously meet people with no T-cells who thrive. And we met many people with large numbers of T-cells in the healthy ranges who develop opportunistic infections and die horribly. The very markers that we are being told cause AIDS have to be questioned. I would say from my experience dealing with over 150,000 people, the big issue is lifestyle is more a threat to their health and our health than infectious disease. And that in many cases, if you refer people to psychologists, they get the information about AIDS from the same inept sources. They believe everyone who's infected is going to die as well. And in many cases, they create more harm than good.
A lot of people with HIV and AIDS I work with, and I've worked with almost 1,500 so far, there's an underlying program for failure among a lot of these people. And the thought of challenging in an area in which they are not expert is something that's very threatening to them. But did you know, you might not know this, you don't actually have to have a medical degree to have AIDS these days. You can be antibody positive without having an MBBS or an MD. You are the expert. What you need to do is to look at all the choices. There's a whole variety of choices around. I went to a meeting in London recently, and in England, we have a thing called the National AIDS Manual that advises you on treatment options in the UK. And I was attacked by the editor of that journal for giving people with HIV and AIDS too much information about HIV and AIDS. And he actually said, and I'll tell you exactly what he said, it was emotional blackmail to ask people taking experimental drugs to question what the results of doing so would be in 10 years' time, when the present is all that really mattered. It was cruel to ask scientific questions when many brave people have already made the difficult decisions to begin these toxic therapies already, and that too much conflicting information could be dangerous. Like hell, if you don't ask the questions before you begin your treatment, when are you going to ask the questions? They'll have to call a seance. You're going to ask at a seance? You have to ask the questions before you begin the treatment. Professor Montagnier made one of the most important statements in what we're talking about, long-term survival. And it's a statement I want you to tattoo onto your foreheads or wherever you choose to. And I wish Montagnier, if he said nothing else yesterday, repeated this. Montagnier said in an interview we published in '88, AIDS does not inevitably lead to death, especially if you suppress the cofactors that support the disease. It's very important to tell this to people who are infected. Psychological factors are critical in supporting immune function. If you suppress this psychological support by telling someone they are condemned to die, your words alone will have condemned them. It simply isn't true that HIV is 100% fatal.
You have to control your life, you have to control the disease. And we can tell you that, but they are now really in the laboratory, and I'm a psychoneuroimmunologist coming from the cell biological field, so I'm no psychologist, nothing. But we have now ways in the laboratory to show that if you control the situation, there are different hormonal patterns and your immune system will be differentially influenced. So you're doing something. And I would really say that this is an important issue. Yes, there are ways to control the disease, and it's very important. There also has also been said, and I think it was by Michael Elmer or Dr. Leibhardt, I don't remember, can you take your own health in your own hands? And this is a very critical issue which we should approach, I think. There's some people who say, yes, you can completely do that. And there are examples of that, multiple. My question is, can you learn everybody to control his health or to control his disease?
We now have evidence that a person's basic psychology affects their body chemistry. So you could take a look at studies of multiple personalities. And personality A has a blood-borne illness, diabetes. The same individual switches to personality C, and there's no evidence serologically of diabetes. I have worked with many long-term survivors, and when you really get to know them intimately, when you really get to hear what they have to say in their story, you're dealing with a totally new personality. They have made many, many changes in their lifestyle and in their selves that I believe, not their medicines, and not in many cases the treatments they're using, but their new psychobiology does not support a life-threatening illness, and they don't have it. And we have to look at that.
I think there's a biological reality to AIDS which you cannot think away. And I sometimes get frightened when all this talk of positive thought and spirituality come up. There is a second component to living well that I think has some biological effects that one can talk about. But I think it's very dangerous to say to somebody who's facing a life-threatening illness, all you have to do is change your attitude. No one has yet said that on this panel. But often that's what people take away.
Positive thinking is where no matter what's going on, a person makes believe everything is fine. That's dangerous and very harmful. What we're talking about is confronting what's taking place and then agreeing I'm going to make the best of it. I'm going to handle it to the best of my abilities and having an inner faith. When I look at this issue, I don't have answers. I think we've helped a lot of people at HEAL dispel the HIV myth. What are we telling people? What are we encouraging? We are programming people to get sick and die. At HEAL, we are totally opposed to that, and that's what we do. We give people the opportunity to see things in a new paradigm with a different perspective, and all of us believe hope is realistic.
From the Alternative AIDS Symposium in Amsterdam, this is Michael Callan, who's had AIDS for 11 years.
There are no answers. There are, as yet, very few answers in which one can have any confidence. Learning to live with uncertainty is extremely painful. But I don't see any other alternative except to fall into fundamentalist false certainty. I have made a career out of sharing my uncertainty. Because the stakes here are life and death, I can't imagine anything else to do. What I did, I became editor of the People with AIDS newsletter, and I would say, here's the medical problem I'm having. I went to the library. I talked to this person. I did this. I did that. I went off in the woods, and here's how I've decided to approach my problem. I would love to hear from other readers to know how you approach this problem. Then they would write in, and I would publish it. And there it would be. There'd be one person who says, never take antibiotics, and another person who'd say, I'm taking high-dose antibiotics, and somebody else would say, I'm taking an herb. That's all I could think to do. I really, in a sense, am jealous of those who are so certain of what they're certain of. I often joke that I failed as an AIDS activist because I didn't get the self-righteous gene, which is so very useful if you want to be an AIDS activist, because you are up against some very evil, powerful enemies, and it helps if you can huff and puff and blow yourself up like a poisoned dog so that you can engage them with your moral certainty and attack them. But I have been unable throughout my entire career to be sure of the things I'm sure of.
Uncertainty is not a theme that runs through the stories you see in the mainstream media. What makes news is the latest theory or projection presented as a new discovery. In addition, according to the people in Amsterdam, there are all kinds of filters that cut down the dissemination of ideas that don't match official dogma.
Our president has a personal view, personal, not he as a head of state, view that condoms shouldn't be used because, Ugandans are not, well versed with condoms, and religious affiliations, views about condoms also came in, and he said, so it's not a time for Ugandans to use condoms. And it was a day after he said that, I ran a program educating people how to use, condoms. I fell into problems because they say, a president says this, and then you go and tell the public that condoms should be used. It was really pathetic because it's the only alternative that we have in our country to prevent AIDS.
In Uganda, condoms are unorthodox. In Britain, the idea that there could be any flaws in the orthodoxy was itself unorthodox until about 2 months ago. Joan Shenton, the television producer, found that of the 350 hours of television documentaries about AIDS broadcast in Britain, only 3 hours challenged establishment views. And those were programs her company made.
You can laugh when you get taken to the Broadcasting Complaints Commission and you can say, it's not very important, we got denounced, we went to this stupid tribunal, they found us guilty of being unfair on 9 counts to the subject of AIDS, if you please. Unfair to the subject of AIDS. And we said, well, they're all silly. But what's happened since is that whenever we want to get a program made, whenever we want to impress anybody to follow this up, those who are against us send the dossier with the adjudication where we were found guilty on 9 counts by a board of the great and the good in Britain of being unfair to the subject of AIDS. And then we get letters back saying, terribly sorry, we can't deal with you because you have actually been found guilty of being unfair to science.
One of the problems with reporting about AIDS in general is that the stakes are so high, and there was a kind of fervor surrounding the disease itself caused by the newness of it, the confusion of it, the drama of it, which led to certain ideas just being immediately solidified in the public mind. And it's that mentality, it's a kind of, I sometimes call it a psychosis that we're up against, and that's why it's not like reporting on some disease where you're not up against the threat of death. Actually, that's what it is. So whatever you say, you always have that, which is actually the gravest of all accusations in life, that you are accountable for human lives, that you are in fact a murderer. Have been called a murderer.
My understanding of the way that journalism is theoretically supposed to work is that if you're writing about something, you're supposed to seek out different perspectives on any issue. That seems only to be required of people like Joan and Jad. When you want to say something controversial, then you hear from your editors that the story isn't balanced and that you've got to go to mainstream, and every controversial thing that somebody says has got to be challenged or responded to by the mainstream. But certainly in America, reporting on AIDS is simply, they're a branch of the federal government's Public Information Bureau. If you're lucky enough or unlucky enough to get government AIDS press releases, and then you read the stories that are written based on them, they are virtually word for word identical. There is very, very little criticism or critical questioning of anything that any official government doctor says about AIDS, and I assume about any other disease as well. There's a very practical reason for that, which is, in fact, I think we saw it around this conference. Some journalists who were initially intrigued, I think in response to Neville's really wonderful stories in the Sunday London Times, it made it a big story. Some medical reporters who wanted to pick up and run with it were told by their sources that if they pursued this at all, that those sources would not be available to them for future stories. In other words, the form of the censorship took was, if you want to write about this or talk about this, you can cross me off your list as a future source for any other AIDS stories, and so they did not. I gave a number of interviews that didn't appear, and I remember saying to the reporters who were very excited, and they said, "Wow, we think this is a really important story, and we think this is really wonderful." And I said, "Well, be prepared, because when you get this thing in the can, the forces opposed to the asking of this question, the having of this discussion, are very powerful."
Scientific theories that win easy acceptance match the orthodox view about how the whole world works. Not too long ago, the Earth was the known center of the universe. Humors controlled what went on in the body. Phlogiston, a non-existent chemical, explained fire. Today, we believe that little things you can only see with fancy technology, little things like electrons and viruses, are the ultimate causes of everything. Now, the real test of any scientific theory is not how plausible it sounds, but what can be done with it. The AIDS scientists, with their HIV theory, have a big publicity system, but the point is to cure the disease, and this hasn't happened. Science, like every other human activity, is imperfect. But the popular press is not set up to be a kind of science police.
It's virtually impossible in 500 words, or even 1,000 words if you're writing, or in the 2.5 minutes that you get on the evening news, or even in an hour documentary is really, what, 47 minutes or something? 52 minutes. It's very, very hard to do justice to the complexity of the issue and to the complexity of people's images. I'm hoping that a lot of footage that's on some cutting room floor is being saved, and that 100 years from now some enterprising researcher will piece together the actual story in all its complexity, because I have seen people give interviews that are really wonderful and complex, but there's this thing that TV people do. I've learned it over the years. They're smiling at you while you're talking. When you go beyond 20 seconds, then they frown and they lower their head because they're thinking, I can't use this now. He talked too long.
We're used to seeing issues like confederation and free trade argued in public, and not just in 20-second clips either. But somehow science is almost never publicly argued in detail, except in those instances like breast cancer, when a scandal becomes just too messy to ignore. The reason is not that science and medicine are hard to understand. The reason is that there's a powerful myth that science is about eternal facts and certainty, not about skepticism and tentative, shifting explanations. But every once in a while, somebody comes along and says, hang on a minute, what's being done here doesn't make sense. That's what happened to AIDS in Amsterdam. A printed transcript of all 3 hours in this Ideas on Camera series is available, and here's our address. It's Ideas, Box 500, Station A, Toronto M5W 1E6. The television transcript costs $8. For $5, you can get a transcript from Ideas on Radio called What Causes AIDS? This CBC radio series by Coleman Jones won the 1991 award from the Canadian Science Writers Association as the best radio program of the year. Same address, Ideas, Box 500, Station A, Toronto M5W 1E6. Thanks for watching. I'm Max Allen.